Imagine sitting in a windowless room. The walls are a neutral, institutional gray, designed specifically to offer no stimulation, no distraction, and absolutely no comfort. The air is slightly too cold, a deliberate environmental stressor. The fluorescent lights overhead hum with a barely perceptible yet relentless frequency that gnaws at your concentration. You have been in this chair for 8 hours. You haven't slept in 20. You haven't had a full meal, only a lukewarm cup of water that sits untouched on the metal table bolted to the floor. Across from you sits an authority figure, a detective whose posture and tone convey an absolute unshakable certainty. They're not asking you if you committed the crime. They are telling you that you did. They have the evidence, they say. They have eyewitnesses who have already identified you. They have a detailed timeline that places you exactly at the scene of the crime, at the precise moment it occurred. You know you are innocent. You know you were at home, watching television alone, completely detached from the horror they are describing in graphic, terrifying detail. But as the hours bleed into one another, a terrifying shift begins to happen inside your own mind. The certainty of your memory starts to fracture. The physical exhaustion makes your thoughts thick, sluggish, and profoundly unreliable. The detective leans in, their voice suddenly dropping to a sympathetic, understanding register, offering you a way out. They tell you that it was an accident, that anyone in your position would have done the exact same thing, that the judge will be lenient and understand if you just take responsibility right now. And suddenly, the impossible idea of confessing to a brutal crime you did not commit doesn't just seem plausible. It begins to feel like the only logical escape route from this psychological pressure cooker. This is not a theoretical scenario pulled from a dystopian novel. This is a clinically documented reality that unfolds in interrogation rooms across the world every single day. It is the precise architecture of the false confession. Today we are going to completely dismantle the psychological mechanisms that cause a rational, high-functioning human brain to override its own reality, to abandon its most basic instinct for self-preservation, and to accept a fabricated truth. We will explore how extreme cognitive load, severe sleep deprivation, and the tactical manipulation of memory can fundamentally alter the prefrontal cortex, transforming an innocent suspect into their own worst enemy. By the end of this clinical analysis, you will understand exactly why the human mind breaks under specialized pressure. You will also realize why the widespread belief that you would never confess to a crime you didn't commit is not only scientifically inaccurate, but dangerously naive. The science explains the mechanism of this collapse, but it also reveals a profound vulnerability in the way we all process reality itself. When we look at the phenomenon of false confessions through the lens of common sense, it seems completely illogical. Society operates on the fundamental assumption that innocence is a shield. We believe that if you have done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide, and therefore you have absolutely nothing to fear from the authorities. The prevailing cultural belief is that only a guilty conscience produces a confession. We view human memory as a reliable video camera, recording events exactly as they happened, securely stored in the pristine archives of the brain, ready to be retrieved flawlessly when needed. If you didn't commit a horrific act, you simply access the memory of what you were actually doing, present it as undeniable fact, and the truth will inevitably set you free. However, clinical research, forensic psychology, and decades of neurological studies reveal a much darker and vastly more complex reality. The scientific consensus is absolute. The human brain is highly susceptible to suggestion, environmental manipulation, and severe cognitive fatigue. The belief that you would never falsely confess is an illusion born of a known cognitive bias, specifically the fundamental attribution error. We consistently underestimate the profound impact of situational factors and wildly overestimate the stability of our own character traits. We think we are immune because we are evaluating the hypothetical situation from a place of safety, well-rested, fed, and entirely free from the crushing weight of an adversarial, high-stakes interrogation. The reality of the system is that interrogations are not designed to discover the objective truth. They are designed structurally and psychologically to secure a confession. Techniques like the widely used Reed technique operate on a psychological framework that assumes guilt from the very first second of contact. The investigator uses intense confrontation to systematically break down the suspect's denials. This is followed immediately by minimization tactics that offer a psychological, emotional, or moral justification for the crime. This sequence creates a devastatingly powerful cognitive trap. The suspect is caught between the terrifying prospect of severe, unavoidable punishment if they continue to deny the accusations, and the perceived leniency and immediate psychological relief offered if they simply agree with the investigator's established narrative. Extensive neurological studies demonstrate that this exact type of pressure, combined with the physical and psychological toll of prolonged isolation, fundamentally alters the brain's decision-making architecture. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive function, logical reasoning, and long-term planning, actually begins to shut down under sustained stress. The amygdala, the brain's primal threat detection center, entirely takes over the cognitive load, pushing the individual into a desperate state of survival mode. In this hijacked state, the brain physically stops calculating long-term consequences, such as the reality of going to federal prison for decades. It focuses entirely and exclusively on short-term survival, which, in the confined space of an interrogation room, simply means making the aggressive questioning stop. The science meticulously documents that under these precise environmental conditions, an innocent person's brain will calculate that falsely confessing is the optimal, most rational strategy for immediate survival. To understand exactly how this happens on a neurological level, we must deeply examine the concept of source monitoring error. Imagine your memory is not a pristine video recording, but rather an overwhelmed, overworked archivist working in a chaotic, poorly lit library. This archivist's job is to take incoming information, categorize it, and store it for later. When you are asked to recall an event, the archivist runs into the massive stacks, grabs the relevant files, and reconstructs the scene for your conscious mind. Under normal, low-stress circumstances, the archivist is reasonably competent and accurate. But during a grueling, hours-long interrogation, the archivist is violently bombarded with new, terrifying, and conflicting information. The detective introduces fake manufactured evidence. They present elaborate hypothetical scenarios as undeniable facts. They repeatedly and aggressively insist on a specific, predetermined narrative. Because the prefrontal cortex, when operating under the heavy cognitive load created by sustained sleep deprivation and fear, loses its reliable access to source monitoring. Source monitoring is the critical process by which the brain distinguishes between what it actually experienced in reality and what it was told it experienced, repeatedly by an authority figure who has already decided what the conclusion should be. The archivist in your brain begins to mix the files. The hypothetical narrative provided by the detective actually gets filed away alongside your actual lived memories. When the suspect is asked to recall the event again, the archivist retrieves the corrupted file. The suspect begins to vividly visualize the crime exactly as the detective described it. They begin to internalize the narrative as their own. This is known in forensic psychology as a coerced-internalized false confession, where the innocent person actually comes to believe, with horrifying certainty, that they committed the crime, often filling in the gaps with their own imagination just to make the story cognitively coherent. Think of it like a complex computer system experiencing a catastrophic memory leak. The system is overloaded with conflicting data, the processing power is severely throttled by stress, and the internal cognitive firewall that separates reality from external suggestion completely collapses. The detective's narrative acts as a malicious virus, quietly overwriting the suspect's original, innocent memories. This neurological vulnerability is brutally exacerbated by the systematic use of maximization and minimization. Maximization is the heavy-handed, aggressive approach, the absolute, unwavering certainty of guilt, the presentation of overwhelming and often legally fabricated evidence, the refusal to accept any form of denial. This shatters the suspect's will. Minimization is the Trojan horse. It offers a lifeline. The detective gently suggests that the crime was entirely spontaneous, heavily provoked, or a tragic accident. They offer a narrative that dramatically reduces the moral and legal weight of the act. To the exhausted, terrified brain, this minimization feels exactly like a rescue. It is the cognitive equivalent of offering a drowning person a heavy iron anchor and successfully convincing them it is a life raft. The implications of this psychological fragility are profound, systemic, and deeply disturbing when applied to the real world. The Innocence Project and other forensic investigative bodies have documented hundreds of tragic cases where individuals spent decades in maximum security prisons, or were even sentenced to death, based solely on confessions they provided for crimes they did not commit. DNA evidence has repeatedly and undeniably exposed the horrifying flaw in our justice system: that a confession is not the ultimate proof of guilt, but rather the ultimate proof of an interrogation's psychological efficacy. When we fully understand the clinical science behind false confessions, we must completely reevaluate the foundational protocols of our justice system. The current model, in entirely too many jurisdictions, relies heavily on psychological techniques that are scientifically proven to elicit false confessions, particularly from the most vulnerable populations. Youth, individuals with cognitive impairments, and those dealing with mental health struggles are disproportionately susceptible to the manipulative, high-pressure architecture of an aggressive interrogation. Their developing or compromised prefrontal cortices are simply no match for the sophisticated, targeted psychological pressure applied by highly trained investigators. This stark reality demands an immediate shift toward investigative interviewing, a modern model focused purely on gathering factual information rather than securing a forced confession. It requires the mandatory, uninterrupted video recording of all interrogations from start to finish, providing a complete, transparent record of the psychological pressure applied. It demands that we, as a society, absolutely stop viewing a confession as the definitive end of an investigation, and start viewing it as a single piece of data that must be rigorously and independently verified against hard forensic evidence. Because as long as we continue to ignore the clinical reality of how the brain responds to severe coercion, we are entirely complicit in a system that inevitably destroys innocent lives in the blind pursuit of closure. If this deep dive into the clinical architecture of false confessions has challenged your perspective on the criminal justice system, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We constantly explore the hidden psychological mechanisms behind criminal behavior and the harsh forensic realities that the mainstream media often completely ignores. Leave a comment below on whether you believe investigators should be legally allowed to lie to suspects during interrogations. Like this video to help us spread this critical clinical analysis, and share it with someone who still firmly believes they would never falsely confess. The science of human behavior fundamentally teaches us that we are profoundly shaped by our environment, and the interrogation room is arguably the most psychologically hostile environment legally permitted in modern society. To break an innocent mind does not require physical torture. It merely requires deep isolation, profound exhaustion, and the strategic, calculated manipulation of reality. Understanding the intricate mechanics of a false confession does not absolve the truly guilty, but it provides a critical, scientifically backed defense for the innocent. It forces us all to confront the highly uncomfortable truth that the human brain, when placed under enough pressure, will always prioritize immediate survival over long-term truth. If you want to understand even more about the profound cognitive vulnerabilities that govern human behavior in extreme, high-stakes situations, click the video on your screen right now, where we analyze the psychology behind psychopathy and explore exactly why certain individuals are entirely immune to the stress that easily breaks the rest of us.